refrain from using flash photography during the program. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Captain Jerry Yellin and Don Brown.
Good evening. For those of you who I've not yet met, my name is Melissa Giller. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for the Reagan Foundation and Institute. On behalf of the men and women around the world who defend our freedom, I know you just sat down, but if I could ask you to please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Ronald Reagan believed fervently in the greatness and goodness of America, and he knew that American strength was central to world peace. Nothing made him prouder than being commander-in-chief. You could actually see in his face how much it meant to him to receive and return a salute. He felt a special bond with the men and women in uniform, especially the young people from the small towns across America. That they were willing to risk their lives for their country never ceased to amaze and humble President Reagan. He would have been so honored to meet our special guest tonight, a gentleman who epitomizes what President Reagan held so dear, a young American not afraid to do what needed to be done to protect our freedom. As you'll hear tonight, Jerry Yellin was a 1941 high school graduate working in a steel factory, trying to raise some money to go to college. On December 7th, he returned home from working the night shift to learn the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He decided immediately to enlist in the Air Force. Serving in World War II between 1941 and 1945, Captain Yellin participated in the first land-based fighter mission over Japan on April 7th, 1945, and also has the unique distinction of having flown the final combat mission of World War II on August 14th, 1945, the day the war ended. After the war ended, Captain Yellin struggled with severe undiagnosed PTSD, and he finally overcame a 3-decade battle in the mid-1970s. And he's now become an entirely different kind of hero, traveling across our great country, sharing his story, and bringing healing and hope to a new generation of veterans struggling and battling with PTSD. Captain Yellin will be joined on stage by Don Brown, a former U.S. Navy JAG officer, who has gone on to become a national best-selling author and who had the privilege of conducting hours of interviews with Captain Yellin to write The Last Fighter Pilot. President Reagan once said, "Veterans know better than anyone else the price of freedom, for they've suffered the scars of war. We can offer them no better tribute than to protect what they have won for us. That is our duty. They have never let America down, and we will not let them down." Captain Yellin, thank you for your service. It's an honor to have you here this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Yellin and Don Brown.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Don Brown. I'm an ex-Navy officer, a practicing attorney, and the author of The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Now, my job tonight is going to be to spend a few minutes to prepare you to meet a man who is a national treasure, Captain Jerry Yellin, who on August 14th, 1945, flew the very final combat mission of the war, and whose young wingman, a 19-year-old kid from New York named Lieutenant Phillip Schlamberg, was the last combat death of the war. But first, on behalf of Captain Yellin and the wonderful professionals at Reagan, and on behalf of myself as well, I'd like to thank the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, the Library and Museum for not only having us, and we're humbled by your invitation, but also for using this prestigious forum to give voice to a great story that until tonight has never been told. This is a part of our history that has been missing, and I thank the foundation for having us tonight. Melissa, thank you. Please give the foundation an appreciation for that. President Reagan, one of the great mantras of his administration was peace through strength. And because of the great strength and daring and courage of men like Jerry Yellin, today in America we enjoyed a period of uninterrupted peace in our homeland for a period of some 70 years. President Reagan, I believe, if he were here tonight, will be very pleased that his great forum is using this to honor such a great man, and we are grateful for this. Winston Churchill once said that never have so many owed so much to so few. He was talking about the Royal Air Force. Churchill was considered to be a prophet in his day. Now, some 75 years later, Churchill's great booming voice has become prophetically true again as we as Americans say goodbye every day to the World War II generation. Once again, never have so many owed so much to so few. And God bless them all. Now, it was the morning of August 14th, 1945, on a windswept island thousands of miles from home called Iwo Jima. The sun had started to rise above the horizon that morning when dozens of young fighter pilots began to assemble to report to their commanding officers. 5 months earlier, U.S. Marines had stormed Iwo Jima in the heaviest and bloodiest amphibious invasion in the history of the Marine Corps. And just 5 days before that, a U.S. B-29 called Boxcar had dropped a second American atomic bomb on a city called Nagasaki. It was hoped that the atomic bombs would end the war. President Truman called the bombing off for a day or so to give the Japanese a chance to surrender. But the Japanese did not surrender. And so the president ordered the attacks to resume. These young pilots they would be part of the tip of the aerial spear in the great invasion of Japan. It was called Operation Downfall. America had already lost 400,000 men in World War II, but military analysts estimated that it would cost another 1 million lives if we had had to invade Japan. And on that morning, it appeared to these pilots that the atomic bomb was not working. Two young pilots, Captain Jerry Yellin, only 21 years old, and his young wingman, 19-year-old Phil Schlamberg, a kid from Brooklyn, New York, who could not even drive a car, but yet was piloting one of the most advanced fighter pilot in the world, were called to meet with their commanding officer, Major Jim Tapp, to receive the orders of the day. The orders of the day required them to take off and to fly 4 hours one way in the cramped cockpit of a P-51, to engage in military targets on the ground, in this case, a Japanese military airfield north of Tokyo, and to come back. Lieutenant Schlamberg, who had flown missions with Captain Yellin as his wingman in the past, went up to him and said, "Captain, I got a premonition. I don't believe I'm going to make it." And Captain Yellin, who had taken Schlamberg under his wing, see, Captain Yellin and Lieutenant Schlamberg, as it turned out, were the only Jewish members of their fighter squadron, the 78th Fighter Squadron, which is part of the 2015th Fighter Group. And Captain Yellin had taken Schlamberg under his wing and was like a little brother to him. So Captain Yellin had learned that when fighter pilots say that, "I don't think I'm going to make it," that premonition often turns true. So Captain Yellin tried to say, "Look, let's substitute somebody out. You got to have the eye of the tiger." He went to the commanding officer, Major Tapp, said, "I think we ought to sub somebody out," but Major Tapp said, "Only the doc can do it." Lieutenant Phil Schlamberg refused to take himself off that mission. So around sunrise, Yellin and Schlamberg take off, headed to Tokyo to carry out this mission today. And as that was happening, unbeknownst to them, in Japan, a great battle was taking place internally. You see, one of the reasons the Japanese had not surrendered is because there was an internal battle going on inside Japan as to whether they should surrender. And in fact, that morning, elements of the Japanese military were attempting a coup against Emperor Hirohito to prevent the surrender announcement from being made. They wanted us to invade. Schlamberg and Yellin had no clue. They carried out their duties. 4 hours later, they arrived over Tokyo, spotted their target. They went down into a steep dive for a strafing mission, one of the most dangerous missions that a fighter pilot could engage in those days because you put yourself in the teeth of enemy anti-aircraft fire. Carried out their mission, attacking the airfield, attacking planes on the ground, and then pulled up steeply back into the clouds. They went into a bank of clouds. A moment later, Captain Yellin came out the top of the bank. Lieutenant Schlamberg was gone, apparently brought down by enemy anti-aircraft fire. Jerry looked for his friend, could never find him. There was a code that was supposed to be broadcasted to pilots when the war ended. It was the word Utah. They never got a code. Jerry, by this point, was running low on fuel and had to head back to Iwo Jima. When he landed, he found that the war had ended and that his young friend, Phil Schlamberg, had become the last combat death of the war. And tonight we're here to honor these men for their great work. What I'd like to do is I have a PowerPoint I'd like to walk you through for a few minutes to set up what we were doing in Iwo Jima and why we were there. So I will invite your attention to both of the slides here. And you never know what's going to happen when you're dealing with a PowerPoint the first time, but we'll give it a shot. Some people have asked me, in fact, we've been in national radio interviews all week, what inspired you to write Last Fighter Pilot? Well, I'll tell you, it was in the spring of 2015, I saw a YouTube that Captain Yellin had been back to Iwo Jima in March of 2015 to honor the 70th anniversary of the Marines invasion. The Marines invaded in February the 19th was D-Day of 1945. 70 years later, these men had been invited back by the Japanese government, by our military, to honor them for their service. Very few were left. In fact, Captain Yellin was the only fighter pilot that was able to return. And I watched the YouTube, and I encourage you to go home tonight. I give homework assignments. So go home tonight and YouTube, find this on YouTube. It's only about 5 minutes. It's worth your time. He had come back to stand for and represent the men that he had served with, many of them who had been killed in those air operations, many who had gone on to pass away later on. And as I was just gripped by it, I could sense that the man had a sense of total humility and that he had come basically not to stand for himself, but to stand for them. He said that the greatest honor of his life was to serve his country, and then went on to tell the story of the final mission. And I knew that I had to try to write the book. So I called Captain Yellin, and the greatest blessing of writing this book is meeting this man, and he's become my friend, and he's a true American treasure. This is the final chapter of a great war, which had never been told until now, the final combat mission of the war. So why write the book? Well, that answer is easy. First off, I wanted to honor these men, these two great Americans who flew the final mission. You can see their pictures there. It's Captain Yellin, and there's Second Lieutenant Phil Schlamberg. Lieutenant Schlamberg was the youngest of 10 Jewish kids in a poor family in Brooklyn. He was brilliant, though, and he graduated first in his high school class at Abraham Lincoln High School. Could have gone anywhere he wanted to in the Army, but he chose fighter planes. Cut off at the year 21. This is Captain Yellin with his first plane on Iwo Jima, the WWII. Standing with him is Lieutenant Danny Mattis, a kid from Clemson, who on June the 1st, 1945, there was a great mission to Japan. Captain Yellin had been grounded that day. The only time he was grounded in 6 months because of a dental issue. And Danny took Jerry's plane, the WWII. This is Jerry briefing him on the mission. These fighters went up and got caught in a major storm that was really just took 27 of our planes, bobbing around like ping pong balls, and 27 wound up in the bottom of the ocean. You're looking at a photograph of Lieutenant Danny Mattis about 2 hours before he would lose his life for this country. And Lieutenant Schlamberg, his body was never found. And He now is commemorated the tablets of the missing at the Punch Bowl National Cemetery in Honolulu. You can find his name there, but there he is in the cockpit as a P-51. Flying an advanced fighter plane, can't even drive a car. It is unbelievable, isn't it? It really is. They're telling me to aim at the back door. There we go. Thanks for your help, guys. I'll need it. I also wanted to honor the men of Jerry's squadron. You're looking at the 78th Fighter Squadron. They were the best doggone squadron in the Air Force, weren't they, Jerry? There you go, see? You can take that to the bank. And you can see, this is an earlier picture. Actually, that's Jim Tapp, who was Jerry's last commander. You see Jerry right in the middle here. Jerry, you're still a good-looking guy, but this is Jerry's autograph right there, and the members of the 78th Fighter Squadron who were, he and Schlamberg were both members of that squadron. I wanted to bring honor to them, and also I wanted to honor all the pilots, the 7th Fighter Command who served in Iwo Jima during the last 7 months of the war, and you see a collection of photographs there from Iwo Jima. There you see Mount Suribachi with the P-51s over the top. Where's my door? There we go. Now, here we go. Everybody recognizes this photograph, right? It's the iconic photograph by Joe Rosenthal. We have the Marines pushing the flag up on Iwo Jima, and I just want to correct the record that in the original flag raising, there was a U.S. Navy member involved in that as well. Corpsman Phil Bradley, what are you laughing at down there? A little inter-service rivalry thing. But this is one of the greatest military photographs ever taken. People see that photograph, but nobody really knows why we took Iwo Jima. Well, the answer lies, this movie Memphis Belle is not actually historically correct, but there are some truths to Memphis Belle, and it underscores a point. In the summer of '43, we had been flying long-range missions from England into the heart of Germany, deep into the heart of Germany with B-17s and 24. Their mission was to strike the heart of Germany and to weaken Germany's industrial and military power for the coming invasion, which turned out to be Operation Overlord. But there was a problem. The bombers were out flying their coverage deep into Germany, and they were largely defensive. Look at that picture. They were flying beyond their fighter coverage and getting shot up by the Luftwaffe. It's the actual photograph of a B-17 with its wing shot off. And this is what happens without fighter coverage back in those days. All right, there were a large number of missions flown, and therefore it was a military success. However, it was costly. August the 17th, 1943, we lost 60 bombers in a single day as a result of these bombers out flying their fighter coverage. The man who headed these attacks up was then Colonel, later to become General Curtis LeMay. Some of you all know that name. He was an outstanding bomber pilot and flew many of the missions himself. He was audacious and managed to escape, but he flew into the teeth of the enemy and dropped a lot of bombs. By August of 1944, the tide of the war began to turn. We're now past D-Day. We have established a beachhead in Europe, and our forces are moving to the east toward Germany. We had to deal with the Battle of the Bulge and Market Garden, a couple of things, but basically the handwriting was on the wall. So General LeMay, who's now a two-star general, is sent to the Pacific. And his job is to execute a bombing plan of Japan, just like there had been a bombing plan of Germany. Because we first attacked from the air, we softened them up, we weakened their capacity, and then we invade. So LeMay's job was to carry out that mission. Now we were using these new B-29 super fortresses. And he decided, General LeMay did, for a number of reasons, the best place to launch these attacks was from the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The final atomic bombs, as you may know, were dropped from Tinian Island. But there's an issue with that. In November of '44, this bombing campaign started to the Mariana Islands. But the problem was, depending on where you're flying in the Mariana Islands, it was 1,300 to 1,500 miles one way. And the P-51s, as we could not do in Germany, could not make that trip. It was just too far. It would be nearly 3,000 miles for the B-29s to strike Japan from the Mariana Islands, and General LeMay was not going to sacrifice his B-29s. Wasn't going to happen. So without fighter coverage, the B-29s were staying up high at like 30,000 feet to stay above anti-aircraft fire. Enter Iwo Jima, 1944 to 1945. The need for an airfield in the middle of the ocean. This was actually drawn by one of the pilots to sort of explain the geography. Iwo Jima Island, which the Marines took in that bloody invasion, was located roughly halfway between the Mariana Islands and Japan. It was almost due south, but not quite. It's kind of a southwest-northeast tilt. But it was the perfect location, at least in theory, to establish an air base for fighter planes to operate from, and also to recover the B-29s that were being shot up and having mechanical problems coming back from Japan. I say in theory. I say in theory because if you launch these and get fighter coverage, you can protect the B-29s and they can come in closer, but no pilot had ever flown this long, not in a P-51. I mean, it's a small aircraft. They're strapped into the aircraft. I mean, I flew, from Charlotte to Los Angeles day before yesterday, got up, moved around, yawned a little bit, got some extra coffee, went to see the flight attendant, I guess they call me on, all kinds of stuff. And even with the bombers, the crew could move around, but not in a fighter plane. So it was still potentially problematic because it was such a long flight. B-29 was large and spacious, but the P-51, I'd say, was cramped. It was 4 hours one way. They would have to carry out their mission and fly 4 hours back. Now, just imagine being strapped in any chair for 8 to 9 hours. Y'all sitting there, we're going to hold you for 8 to 9. The Reagan Library, as a teaching point, is going to strap you all in. We'll let you out 3 in the morning, Jerry. We'll go. They'll say strap, so you can appreciate what these guys were doing. All right? So they decided to give it a go. Now, I want you to know that all of these fighter pilots were volunteers. Nobody made them do it. On March 7th, 1945, they flew from Saipan to Iwo Jima from Saipan. And when they flew in, we've got this recorded in the book, Jerry will tell you, the Marines had not finished the job. They had partially finished the job. Iwo Jima, when you look at it from the air, it looks like a pork chop. And at the narrow part of the pork chop is Mount Suribachi, all right? It is only about a couple of miles from one end to the other and about 800 yards wide at the widest, full of Japanese, 22,000 Japanese troops buried in Iwo Jima. Jerry has pointed this out to me on a number of occasions. The Japanese were not on Iwo Jima, they were in Iwo Jima. And so the Navy had been bombing Iwo Jima, hitting it with battleship fire, artillery fire, naval gun fire, and naval aviation for several weeks leading up to the invasion, the Marines' invasion, but the Japanese would go in the hole. It was hard to get them. So when Marines hit, they came out, and it was rough. Then they run back in again. March 7th, the Marines still had not finished their job. So these fighter pilots come in over the top of Mount Suribachi and come in and pancake down onto one of the runways that the Marines had secured, South Field. When they landed in a hot zone. Jerry will tell you, and in the book we recount this, the first thing he noticed was the stench of death because there were bodies of Marines lined up in piles all along the runway. The flies are incredible. The first thing these guys were told to do is get a shovel and go dig a foxhole, and they spent the first few nights in a foxhole listening to mortar fire, not knowing if they would survive the night to get in their cockpit the next day. But they survived for a night or two. Here's a shot of Iwo Jima, a picture of it. Just in February, this is 2 days before the Marines invaded, 17 February 45, U.S. military photo. You can see the fire from the naval bombardment. It did very little good. So they landed and were reinforced. At first, the fighters were taking off the next day to come out, swing back around, and help the Marines attack the Japanese. On August 7th, 1945, 1 month after they landed, they tried this first very long-range mission. It was the first of its kind. Jerry and his squadron mates strapped into the P-51, and as the B-29s came over from the Mariana Islands, they took off. 8 hours one way, protecting the B-29s. The B-29s dropped their payload and came back. It would be the first of 19 long-range missions this man would fly, the first of 19. It's just hard to imagine the circumstances under which they were operating. So Captain Jerry Yellin would wind up flying really he would be among the pilots flying the first combat mission ever flown by an Army Air Force fighter pilot over Japan, and the very last mission of the war itself. Between that first and that last flight, Captain Yellin would fly another 17 combat missions over Japan. A number of his friends would not make it back. Really, the period from May of 1945 until that last mission of the war, as the emperor announced his surrender when these guys were executing the final mission, he lost a lot of his friends. They were very close to him. The last being Phil Schlamberg, who was like a little brother to him. Danny Mattis, you saw Danny's picture a moment ago, who was lost in Jerry's original plane in a storm. Dick Schroppel, who was shot down over Jima, about 70 miles north of Iwo Jima, and who there was a valiant rescue attempt to save Dick. We brought in Catalina, U.S. Navy Catalina, to try to come in and land and rescue him under heavy fire, but the Japanese got to him and killed him. This all took a very, very heavy toll on Jerry, as it would on anyone. A number of these stories, of course, are accounted for in the book. And they say that it's amazing, isn't it, when slideshows malfunction. Now we're going to see how good I really am if I can wing the rest of it, right? A lot of the stories of the great heroism of these pilots is in the book. And what we've sought to do together, we've collaborated on this together. Jerry spent hours on the phone with me. I was in his home in Orlando a couple of months ago. Is to bring honor to their memory. Not just, we want to right the wrong that history has left by leaving this great final historic mission out. We want to do that. But we also want to bring honor to the men of the 7th Fighter Command who fought off of Iwo Jima in the last 7 months of the war. And I can write about it in a book, but a book can only do so much justice to the man. There's one man who can tell you what happened to him, and I'd like to take a moment now to present to you Captain Jerry Yellin.
Thank you. Thank you all. Don, I have to ask you a question. Are you talking about me?
I'm talking about your other brother, Jerry.
I was just one of 16 million Americans who served their country in World War II. 16 million of us put on a uniform and went to war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. And we won that war. And Tom Brokaw wrote a book called The Greatest Generation about the fighters, the people who were on the front lines. But I have to look at a different perspective of the greatest generation because I flew with 16 guys who didn't come home. There were more than 400,000 Americans lost their lives in World War II. And when the war ended, we created democracies of our enemies. We created a democracy in Japan, in Germany, and Italy. And today it's 2017, 72 years after 1945, and those three countries are allies and supporters of who we are. And the two countries that we fought with as allies in World War II, Russia and China, seemingly today are the enemies of the world. I've had a very, very long and wonderful life. In 1983, I was a major consultant to the Bank of California, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America in San Francisco. And they asked me to go to Japan in 1983. And I looked at the guy as if he was crazy. They wanted me to speak to the Mitsui Bank Group, a huge conglomerate of banks in Japan for investments. And I looked at the man and asked me, and I said, I'm too busy, I can't go. I was married, I met my wife on a blind date on Good Friday, 1949. She passed away in June 2015. We were married for 65 years. And in 1983, I came home and I said, Helene, you know, I turned down a trip to Japan today. And she looked at me and very quietly said, Jerry, not once have you ever asked me if I wanted to go to Japan. In October 1983, I went to Japan. And I have to tell you, it was a life-altering experience for me, because what I saw and what I thought I knew were two different things. I met people who were real people. They were mannerful. They were cultured. They were educated. They were just an incredible experience that we had. And on the last night that we were there, Helene looked at me and says, you know, Rob would love Japan. I have 4 sons. My oldest, David, is be 68 in November. My youngest, Robert, will be 58 in August this month. And she said, Rob would love Japan. 1983, he was a senior at San Diego State University. Let's give him a trip to Japan for a graduation present. So I came home, and I agreed to that. And I said, Rob, we want to give you a present of a trip overseas. If you choose to go to Europe, you got a 1% chance of going. If you choose to go to Japan, you got a 99% chance. So he said, I'll go to Japan. So he graduated from school in 1984. He went there for a 6-week homestay program, came back, didn't know what he wanted to do. So he decided he was going to take a job for 1 year teaching English in Japan. And he went there in 1984 for 1 year. It's now 43 years later, he hasn't come back yet. 33, I don't do the math very well. And in 1987, he called me, sent me a letter, said, come to Japan, you pay for the airfare, I'll take care of everything else. And we went on a tour of Japan with him. And then we met a young lady, and he said that he and the young lady wanted to get married. We were in a restaurant, 1987. And I saw the faces of the 16 guys that I flew with who didn't come home fighting the Japanese. But I had the presence of mind to ask him, have you spoken to their family? What do they say? And he said, the family won't meet me. And I said, will you get married if you don't have permission from the family? He said, we haven't talked about that yet. Well, he did get permission. He met with 2 of Takako's older brothers, of 3 brothers, and the father. And the 2 brothers grilled him and made him promise that if the wedding took place, that he would never, ever move their sister away from Japan, and he agreed to that. And then the father, who was a kamikaze pilot, with 3 or 4 hours in a zero, and was sent to China from 500 people who flew against Americans and killed himself, and he was the only one who lived from the group that he trained with. And he asked my son 5 questions. How old is your father? 63. Was he in the war? Yes. What did he do? He was a pilot. What did he fly? P-51s. Where? Over Japan. And that ended the meeting. And he went home and told his wife, make the wedding. And she went ballistic, crazy ballistic. She said, for 43 years, you've been telling me you never fired a bullet against your enemy, the Americans. You didn't die for the emperor. And now you want our daughter to marry this full-headed, full-bearded guy, Gene, this America who you hate? And he said, yes. And she said, why? And he said, any man who could fly a P-51 against the Japanese and live must be a brave man. And I want the blood of that man to flow through the veins of our grandchildren. So today I'm the grandfather. I'm the grandfather of 3 Japanese grandchildren whom I love as dearly as I love my 3 American grandchildren. There is no difference. I've learned more from my children than I could ever teach them, that we as human beings are all exactly the same. We are not Christians and Jews and Buddhists and Muslims. We're not speaking Japanese. We're not the color of other people. We are all part of the human race. We are all exactly the same. And I learned that from my children. We have 3 professions in the United States: policeman, fireman, military. You put a uniform on. All of those people pledge their lives in the line of duty to give their lives in their line of duty to other people whom they don't know. And we don't recognize the responsibilities that these people have. The pure purpose of war is to kill your enemy. And what is an enemy? It's somebody that believes something different than what we believe or what you believe, and they're willing to take lives to promote what they believe, and that's evil. ISIS today is evil. We have to be a nation united, not a nation angry. We have to unite ourselves as human beings with all the nations of the world, because the difference of 1935, 1941, 1945 is science. We had racial tensions in the 30s. We have racial tensions now. We had religious problems in 1941. We have religious problems now. But science has created nuclear warfare, nuclear weapons. The smallest nuclear weapon in the American arsenal, and I know this for a fact, is 1,000 times bigger, the smallest nuclear bomb, 1,000 times bigger than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's up to us and the young people in the audience to understand that they have a responsibility to the world. We have a responsibility as Americans. We're losing that responsibility for whatever reasons we don't know. But we have to maintain our dignity, we have to maintain our military, we have to maintain our police departments, we have to maintain our fire departments, because those are the people that protect us. 22 young guys who served in Iraq and Afghanistan commit suicide every day. And they fought in wars much different than the war that we fought in World War II. So I'm humbly honored to be at the Reagan Library, to be here tonight, to be with you, to work with Don. I hope if you buy the book, you enjoy it, and you'll pass it on to somebody else. It is history. I'm part of history, but I'm part of 16 million of us who made that history. 8 million young women were Rosie the Riveters who built the tanks and the boats and the airplanes that we flew. We were a nation united, and we have to become a nation united again. And I thank you very much for this moment. Appreciate it.
We're going to have a seat, and we're going to talk a little bit.
Captain Yellin, those are words of wisdom that everyone needs to hear, so please keep spreading your message. So we're going to take questions from the audience now. We do ask that you raise your hand. We have staff members in the audience with microphones. They'll bring the microphone to you, and that's so the cameras in the back can pick up your questions. We can start right over there.
Thank you, Captain. Did the Los Angeles Cavalry leave it to Japan or Iwo Jima on internal fuel, or did you use rockets?
We used external wing tanks to fly to Japan, 205-gallon external wing tanks.
Was the range longer from England to Germany or from Iwo Jima to Japan?
Well, I don't know what they did in Europe. I only know what they did in Japan. And when somebody called in, when we were attacking Japan, flying over Japan, when somebody called 90 gallons from your squadron, the whole squadron would head out to sea to pick up a B-29 that would navigate us back to Iwo Jima. 90 gallons, we could cut our consumption down to 20 or 22 gallons an hour. So we had very little extra fuel. I landed on the first mission with 7 gallons of gas left. 2 guys bailed out, Bob Roseberry, another guy from the 78 Fighter Squadron. Jim Vanderhey, who was our lieutenant colonel, or who led us, his engine quit on the runway. And so it was a tight fit, and we did it. I did it 19 times, and 7 hours and 50 minutes to 8 hours and 10 minutes. I have to tell you, I enjoyed my fight in the war. I was a fighter pilot at the age of 19. You needed 2 years of college or pass an equivalent exam. I passed the exam, and I became a fighter pilot, and I fought for my country. It was the greatest thing that I ever did in my life. But I hope nobody else ever has to do that. The pure purpose of war is to kill. Killing is evil.
The microphone's covered there.
Do you think war is necessary sometimes?
There have been 14,000 plus wars since the history of America, since the history of human beings in the last 5,000 years. Wars are fought because people want something. The first weapon of mass destruction was a rock. And then there were bows and arrows. And then there was gunpowder. And then there was atomic energy. And I think that wars are fought by greedy people, or people who believe something so strongly that they want something from everybody to believe what they believe. ISIS is evil. Japan was evil. Germany was evil. Italy was evil. They wanted to control the world. When we landed on this planet, the people from England landed here in the 1600s and 1700s. They wanted the land, and they were willing to kill the natives who were here on this land prior. And they did that. It was evil then, and it's evil today. But that's what our heritage is. And war that we fought was a defensive war, and that's okay to do. We have to join together to fight ISIS, to get rid of people who are willing to kill other people for what they believe. So you can have a religious belief, you can have a political belief, as long as you don't force it upon other people for your gain. That's the way I feel about war today.
Two questions. One's on a personal note. I'm just wondering if you knew of William Winter.
What do you say?
Do you know William Winter?
No, I don't.
He was a war correspondent. He was my father's brother-in-law, served during World War II, during that time. And there were innuendos that he was the man who sent out the message, the Morse code message to send out the Enola Gay. And he was involved in some...
Don't know the name.
Don't know the name. Or James Shepard.
James Shepard.
What?
He's asking about.
Or James
No,
Shepard.
the only man that I knew of was Ernie Pyle.
Okay.
That's the only man that I remember.
Okay, that's hard, yeah.
Yeah. you're
And
welcome.
then, on a political note, what do you think about the situation in North Korea today? How will that play out? Do you have any?
Well, the situation today is critical because if North Korea gets attacked or attacks another nation, we're going to have the beginning of the destruction of the Earth's ability to sustain life. That's what nuclear warfare will do. We will not be able to sustain life wherever nuclear war happens. North Korea is a danger. And
Do you have any opinion on how it will play out in North Korea?
Well, I'm hoping for everybody's sake that it doesn't play out with them sending a ballistic missile to the United States or to China or to Japan, because we're pledged to do what we have to do as a nation to attack them. And the Koreans are human beings too. They're not all in politics. I think I have time to tell you a story, and I'd like to share that with you. I lived in a small town in Fairfield, Iowa, 10,000 people. And 2 of my fingers were turning black 2 years ago, and I went to my local doctor. And they said, we can't take care of you. You have to go to Burlington, Iowa, to the regional hospital and see a cardiologist. Just a minute. And I waited a minute, and they said, be there at 1:30 on Monday. At 1:30 on Monday, I walked into a cardiology office at the Burlington, Iowa Regional Hospital, and I didn't recognize one name. So I asked the receptionist, who am I going to see? And she said, you're going to see Dr. Al-Wadani. I said, where's Dr. Al-Wadani from? She said, Palestine. Now you got a Jewish guy going to see a Palestinian doctor. And I said, I'm going to say something to this guy. I'm not a fan. I lived in Israel. I emigrated to Israel and came back. I played in the Maccabee Games in 1965 when I was 41 years old as a golfer. That's the Jewish Olympics, the year after the Olympics. And 38, 40 nations send athletes. And I'm not a fan of what Netanyahu is doing with the Palestinians, with the territory and all the rest of it. So I said to myself, I'm going to say something to this doctor. So I said, Dr. Al-Wadani, what is your first name? He said, Abdullah. I said, may I call you Abdullah? He said, absolutely. I said, Abdullah, I lived in Israel. I'm a Jewish guy. I'm not a fan of what's happening there now. Palestinians are people. You're a Palestinian. You're a person. And then when I said that, he stood up and he pointed his finger at me and said, you have no idea who or what we are. And I took that. And then when he's finished examining me, he said, here's a prescription, come back in 10 days, and I started to leave the office. And he says, excuse me, Mr. Yellin. I said, call me Jerry. He said, Jerry, do you know what my hobby is? I said, I don't have a clue what your hobby is. He said, my hobby is World War II. I've read every single book that I could read about World War II. But you are the first World War II veteran that I ever met in my life. So I stayed there for 20 or 30 minutes and talked to him about my experiences in World War II, and I went home. My wife had passed away. I was getting rid of everything that I had. I had a model, a scale model of my P-51. It was, I don't know, 1/100th of what it was, but the markings and the name. And I packed it up and I mailed it to Dr. Al-Wadani in Burlington. 10 days later, I'm back in his office, and my plane's sitting on his desk. And he walks in, starts to examine my fingers, stands up, and said, Jerry, you touched my heart like few people ever touched my heart. And he reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a string of Muslim prayer beads. He said, my father died when he was 72 years old. And he carried these beads every day of his life, and I want you to have them. And I said, I can't take them, Abdullah. These belong to your children, your grand. He says, I want you to have them. Now, I go around and I talk. I don't have the beads with me because I didn't know if I was going to talk or not here. But I pull out the Muslim beads, which I carry, so I can tell people that we are all human beings together on this planet, period. End the conversation. I thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
It's an honor. It's an honor to be in your presence. My father-in-law was also in World War II, and have my little girl who's 9 years old here with me today, and we are just honored to be here. I wanted to ask you, if you were to speak to children, what would you convey to them besides the story you just conveyed was pretty powerful, but what else would you maybe
Well, I speak to children a lot.
Awesome.
There's another profession in the United States called teachers. Teachers learn a subject, and every day in school, they give part of themselves to the students. So I tell students the only way that you can thank the teacher is by working to your capacity to work. Not everybody can be an A student, not everybody can be a B student, not everybody can be a C student, but every student can work to their capacity. And if the young people do that, work to their capacity, they're telling the teacher thank you, and they're getting more knowledge. So that's what I talk about to a 9-year-old girl.
Captain Yellin, when you were 20, 21 years old, you're out there flying your missions. What was it that motivated you to get up and do it? Not that, you're following orders, of course, but can you recall at that time, at that age, what was it that motivated you to get up there and do that?
Well, of course I recall. We were attacked by a nation unprovoked. We were told all the things that they did, the Bataan Death March, the rape of Chinese people. They were attacked by we were attacked by another nation. And I had to defend my nation. My hero is as a young man, I made model airplanes when I was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. My heroes were the World War I pilots, the Rickenbackers, the folks, Richthofen, and the people who flew the fighter planes in World War I. And then the Battle of Great Britain, the British pilots. There was a guy by the name of Bader, B-A-D-E-R, who crash landed a Spitfire and lost both his legs and continued to fly with artificial legs. And then the Flying Tigers, which went over to China, and they were my heroes. Lindbergh was my hero until he made a speech in Des Moines, anti-Semitic speech about America. And that destroyed a lot of my feeling for him. I lived in Hillside, New Jersey, which was next to the German-American Bund, and on Bond Street. And when I was going to be bar mitzvahed when I was 13 years old, and some of the guys that I played ball with saw me going in there, and I became a Jewish guy, and 3 years later, my whole house was covered with swastikas. And that's what I faced, and I was a patriot. I'm an American. If I asked a question of you here, how many of you here, I'd like to ask this question, have descendants who are American Indians in this country hundreds and hundreds of years ago? How many of you are descendants? Stand up, please. Please stand up. How many of you are people who had relatives that came to this country on the Mayflower? Stand up and stay standing, please. How many of you have people who came on the Mayflower? How many in this audience have people that came from another country to live in this country way back? How many in the audience are children of immigrants from every country in the world? Stand up. There isn't anybody in here, except if you're a Hawaiian, that is a Native American. We're all immigrants, and we cannot forbid them from coming to this country. We're all together in this. We're all human beings. I put it to you this way. Men are planters of seeds. Women are nurturers of life. And any man in any country can fertilize the egg of any woman in any country. It comes with the territory. Nobody goes to fulfill the purpose of what life is, all life, which is to recreate everything, the birds and the bees and the human beings, recreation. Nobody in this audience that has children went to recreation school. It comes with the territory, and we do that. And that's what the purpose of life is from my viewpoint. It might not be from your viewpoint. I'm not trying to tell you something. It's what I believe. I saw it when my son fertilized the egg of a Japanese woman and gave me 3 grandchildren. We're all the same. More questions?
Captain Yellin, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans involved in the military. In the last 15, 16 years, the American military's been in constant combat, Iraq, Afghanistan, places like Somalia, Yemen, and it's only 1%. There's just a handful of Americans anymore that even know anybody or have a relative in the military. That 1% is bearing the burden that was borne by a much larger contingent in past conflicts. Those past conflicts, for the most part, had much more support. What do you think about the change here of so few people, small, very professional, highly trained, volunteer military, bearing this burden, particularly with the reserves and National Guard being deployed multiple times abroad? I was in the Cold War as an Army officer after Vietnam, and I saw the contempt, really, that a lot of the civilians had for the American military coming back. And you know, you were in a different time, and I'd just be curious of your thoughts on that subject. Thank you.
Well, I've yet to meet an American in any place that I've been that didn't have a relative who served in World War II. That's a fact. Everybody knows somebody in their family that served in World War II. 16 million of us. It was a war that had to be fought. I'm not sure that Vietnam or Korea, North Korea, or Vietnam had to be fought. That's a political issue. I don't want to get into politics. I'm not a politician. Iraq and Afghanistan. It's what people in power do, most of it for money. The pure purpose of war is to make money in most instances, and to kill other people for what you believe. So I can't get into the politics of the Reagans, the Bushes, the Clintons, the Kennedys, or anybody else. But if you declare war on another country for a reason, that you were attacked, I approve of that. The 1% is all we need. 3 million people out of 300 million people, because the technology doesn't require military guys going to war, 67,000 Marines invading an island of 8 square miles, 23,000 Japanese, that's 90,000 people on 8 square miles of land, fighting hand-to-hand combat. You can emulate the sights and you can emulate the sounds of war, but you can never, ever emulate the smell of a battle. I smell it today, 72 years later. So I'm opposed to anything that we do or might do that had no meaning for the good of the world. And those wars had no meaning for the good of the world, in my opinion.
Sir, before my question, after this presentation, I'd like to shake hands with you and give you a hug, if you will let me, to thank you personally.
I'm looking for someone
I'm right
to hug.
here. I'm right here. I know I'm short, but I'm right here. And
Well, I
wore
miss my wife. We were married for 65 years. I travel a lot, alone. Don is not much fun to be with.
Well, I'm with my husband of 55 years. Okay. My question is, did you know Louis Zamperini or ever meet him?
I was in the company of Zamperini's son. And Zamperini, the book on Broughton was a book that I could not read.
Yes.
Because of some of the things that she wrote about that weren't true. But Zamperini was a hero, and he was a prisoner of war for several years in Japan. Everything that she wrote about Hildebrand happened to him, and his picture is in the Blue Room of the Pentagon. My picture is next to his because I'm a Y and he's a Z, and that's the way they do it, alphabetically. There was a guy, William Manchester, who wrote a book called Out of Darkness. It was his story of a Marine when he went back to all the islands, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Vermont. And Out of Darkness, on page 223, he said, now that Iwo Jima was taken, we could begin the bombing of Japan, which was not a fact. That destroyed the whole book that he wrote for me just because I was on Iwo Jima. So I wrote him a letter saying that he owed the fighter pilots an apology because we began bombing in November from the Mariana Islands, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. And 6 months later, I got a letter back from William Manchester. And he said, Captain Yellin, the only thing that I'll apologize to you for is that it took me 6 months to write you a letter. So what if I was wrong? Well, people write about history, and sometimes they take liberties with facts. And Mrs. Hildebrand, or Miss Hildebrand, when she wrote the book Unbroken, took a lot of liberties with the facts.
He was still a hero.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yes, and
The Japanese were not human beings in 1943, 44, 45.
No.
They didn't become human beings until MacArthur went there and showed them what a democracy was like, took away some of the power from the emperor, and showed that he was a person, he wasn't a sun god, which is what they believed, which is what their military believed, more important than what the people believed. I've spoken to many Japanese people in their 70s and 80s who thanked me for being an American and dropping the atomic bombs. Because when they were 8, 9, 10 in school, they were prepared and ordered to learn how to make Molotov cocktails, to use them to kill Americans when the invasion came. And it never happened. So the atomic bomb not only saved my life, but it saved the lives of millions of young Japanese people too. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, so we only have time for one more question, and we did have a microphone here a second ago. So
I have a question from a friend of mine.
Oh, okay, so we'll do that. That'll be the last question.
Brian Frankish. Brian Frankish is the executive producer of one of the finest movies ever made called Field of Dreams.
Brian Frankish.
It was that movie that caused me to meet you on an airplane on the way to Des Moines back in 1989, many, many years ago. And you moved me over and said, I got to tell you a story. You told me the story of your life on an airplane to Des Moines. We've been friends ever since. But I'd like you to explain to the audience, I understand you have been working with PTSD, damaged warriors, teaching them Transcendental Meditation. Could you explain to the audience a little bit about the program that you're involved in?
Yeah. In 1975, a man came to America from India. His name was Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, to teach TM to the Americans, and he was on the Merv Griffith show. My wife was suffering from my behavior. I was not the guy she married, or she thought she married. I was the father of 4 children. I couldn't hold a job. We moved 15 or 16 times. Undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. So she said to herself, she's going to learn TM. My second son was a tennis player at the University of Pennsylvania in 1975. He was an all-Ivy League player, #1 player at the University of Penn. And he was home on summer vacation going to Europe to play a home-and-home tennis series with Oxford and Cambridge and St. John and in Scotland. And my wife, and he was enrolled in rabbinical school. And my wife said to Stephen she was going to learn TM, and he said, wait till we come back from England. We're going to stay for Wimbledon, and then we're coming back, and he wanted to learn TM. So he learned TM, and my wife learned TM, Transcendental Meditation, a technique that you don't have to change your mind, you don't have to change your religion, you don't have to change your clothes. It's a technique that's 5,000 years old from India that is you use as a tool to relieve stress. So Stephen went to rabbinical school, and he was there for 1 month after he learned TM, and he quit, took a leave of absence for a year, because now he was learning to be inward, and meditation taught him how to be outward. And my wife meditated, and in August of 1975, I took it upon myself to learn TM, and within 2 weeks, I was back to being a human being, feeling good about myself. I went to work, I did things that normal people do, not people who suffer from tremendous stress. I was raised, thou shalt not kill, by my family. Thou shalt not kill. One of the 10 commandments. We all learned that. And then I put a uniform on and I killed. And I suffered for it. I suffered because of 16 guys that I knew. 3 of them killed them that I trained personally. I trained them all. And I suffered from that. And the kids today suffer from that. You learn how to kill, you can't talk about it, never talk about it. It wasn't until 1988 when I went to Japan that anybody in my family found out what I did when I wrote a book called Of War and Weddings, which Regency will probably release this spring again, Of War and Weddings. So, you know, at 93 years old, I have a pure purpose of my life, and that's to tell my story, to help Don tell the story of the last mission with the last fighter pilot. There's about 200,000 veterans alive. I was one of 6 on Iwo Jima this past March. I'm going back again next March because my granddaughter from Japan, Sarah, wants to be a journalist and a writer and a reporter. And I went with her in 2016, 2017. I'll go back in 2018 if I'm here, because she wants to go and she wants to tell everybody the story. She had 2 grandfathers who hated each other and then became family, and she wants to tell that story. My oldest grandson in Japan's name is Kentaro. We call him Ken. He has a master's from the MIT of Japan as a physicist. His brother Simon, S-A-I-M-O-N, my father's name was Simon, went to the University City of London to study philosophy, which he graduated from as a philosophy student in 3 years on a 4-year course, and was awarded a full 2-year scholarship at Oxford to get his master's in philosophy, which he graduated from in 1 year. So these kids are bright kids, and Sarah she's at the Tokyo School of Foreign Studies, and she wants to be a journalist and a writer and write books and stuff like that. So they're going to make a contribution to the world, the same as my grandchildren in America hopefully will make a contribution. And I found out from them what my life is now. I give it to you willingly and humbly and happily, and I'm just in awe of the things that have happened to me in my life that didn't happen to the other guys who are my age. And I can't thank you enough for being here. Thank you again. Bless you all. Thank you.
Captain Yellin, Don, thank you both so much for being here today. We don't usually promote that we have all these events on our YouTube channel, but if you go to youtube.com/Reagan Foundation, you can watch this again and again and again.